Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Yeah, so welcome to the Stoa, everyone. Sorry about the delay today. We had some technical glitches, but we're here. So last session of The Bridge, Vic McMullen's deep dive SenseMaker in Residence for the month of January. This is the last session on magic. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. 90 minutes in total. Evan's going to share his screen. He's going to present, and then we're going to pivot to Q&A. So that being said, I'm going to give you co-host access, Evan. You want it to your both accounts, or there you go. All right, man. So you have both accounts shared. You can share screen access.
All right, full of tech glitches today, so let's go ahead and get started. So this topic today is bridging science and magic. So again, I've kept the slides to a minimum for today, and so that way we can spend the most amount of time looking at what is alive for people in terms of Q&A. This is strange. Okay, there we go, loading. Yeah. Magic and tech glitches go together like apple pie and whipped cream or something like that. So what is magic? So, kind of a common definition, Aleister Crowley's definition, is the science and art of causing change to occur according to will. So that's as good a working definition as any. There's a lot of other definitions out there. I'll touch on a few as we go through this session. And so what I'm using it for is as a pointer at abilities and capacities that are considered somewhere in the neighborhood of unachievable, rare, uncanny, or supernatural, according to the prevailing cultural definitions and assumptions. And so I put a note here, that due to this, what is considered magic changes across space and time. So it's going to be quite dependent on your culture and your other factors like that. So that's kind of interesting. So I also think it's interesting to point out that science and magic share roots in the Western tradition. Nearly all of the really important thinkers that we, in the lineage that we now refer to as science, especially if you look at any time period that is, say, earlier than the 20th century, were also students and practitioners of the occult or magical arts. And many of the early scientific fields emerged from the work of these figures, and in their own work and worldviews, they wouldn't have seen as much of a distinction between things we now regard as scientific versus things that we now regard as occult or magical. I just threw a few examples up here. So you have Newton, Leibniz, Aristotle, Descartes, Plato, Socrates, Parmenides. These are all key figures in the Western rationalist lineage, essentially, and they were all, in their own way, occult practitioners. And some examples of the way these fields have shared a common lineage. Well, chemistry only became separate from alchemy sometime in the 1600s, roughly. Same thing with astronomy from astrology. Mathematics essentially derives from Pythagorean mysticism, and you could go on with this. So when we take a look at how these traditions came to be and what they really are, they're traditions of basically talented people who dedicated their lives to better understanding the nature of the world around them. And this is also true of the occult and magical traditions. It's no coincidence that the same people were often involved in both, especially when we get to really high-level practitioners. Also, science is a moving target. The best-in-class theories of the day often turn out to be wrong, incomplete, or not even wrong in hindsight. And not all the technologies of a given age are perfectly explicable by the science of that age. There's a lot of examples of that you can look at where, okay, we've got a technology, we know it works, but we actually don't have a way to scientifically explain all of the principles behind that technology. And, just as a sort of metaphor that's not really a metaphor, we have successfully now automated the process of enchanting rocks such that they can think. So beware statements about what is impossible. That was a reference to processors in computers, if people didn't catch the play there, but that's basically what we're doing, is enchanting rocks so that they can think. So some concepts that are useful in understanding magic from the Bridge series so far. So virtualism, and I put a copy paste of the sort of capsule definition of virtualism I've given before. So virtualism has to do with the notion that this entire phenomenal world is in fact being dreamed by a mind. This mind is not identical with what we perceive as the self. The mind is being generated by the brain of a social primate, which exists in a reality, which mind does not and probably never can have direct access to. Only indirect signals can propagate into the mind. And then the other concept that I've talked about in the previous Bridge sessions that's relevant here is the concept of metis. So this has to do with cunning intelligence, intense present moment awareness, navigating situations of unknown unknowns. It's not the same as techne, episteme, or phronesis, other Greek words having to do with skill and knowledge. Phronesis is the most related, but in the earlier writings of, say, the pre-Socratic philosophers, it might be thought of as having to do with the cultivation of metis rather than metis itself. And then this distinction becomes less relevant in the Greek writings around the time of Plato. So I'm going to just go on to the next slide. Come on. There we go. So I particularly like the definition of sorcery from Carlos Castaneda's Don Juan figure. He says, sorcery is the act of embodying certain specialized observations about the nature of the interaction of perception and reality. This is not a bad definition. So we might ask ourselves, okay, what sort of observations are to be embodied here? And well, the answer is the sort of observations made by virtualism. And so when virtualism is embodied, new possibility spaces can open up. So let's talk about why we might want to embody virtualism. So the potential for magic exists in the differences between world and reality, and the ways that I'm using these terms in my definition of virtualism. And the fruits of PSI, phenomenological self-inquiry practices, allow us to explore and exploit some of these differences. Specifically, phenomenological self-inquiry can give us conscious attentional access to layers of processing which are normally unconscious. And sustained phenomenological self-inquiry practice ends up subjectively proving to one that something very much like virtualism is indeed the case. So how does this get us towards magic? Well, by tweaking the lower layers of the mind's processing through this lower level access to those layers, which is enabled through sustained phenomenological self-inquiry, we can exert a surprising degree of control over the world that we find ourselves in, without even considering how practice can enhance our abilities to apply choice to the causal layers of reality, again, as I'm using the term in the discussion of virtualism. So I also think that virtualism is interesting in terms of enabling ontological design. So this is a phrase which has come up a lot in the STOA lately. Ontological design. There's been ontological design sessions, and I'm a big fan of this phrase. When you think about the connections between the phrase ontological design and, say, the concept of reality tunnels, as people like Robert Anton Wilson have spoken of, then this kind of becomes apparent where it intersects with the idea of ontological design, reality tunnels, and magic. So basically, we could think about ontological design, reality tunnel creation or selection, shifting into a different mode of being, the re-enchantment of the cosmos. These all seem to be pointing in a fundamentally similar direction as far as the actual move that they would ask a human to make. And so given that our phenomenal worlds bear very little resemblance to the underlying physical causal reality, there seems to be a lot of wiggle room in terms of what we end up experiencing as real. So just as an example, classic example, we experience colors as real. They're an absolutely integral part of our ontologies as selves that experience worlds, and yet they don't exist out there in reality. There's many other examples we could go into here. And so the ontological design space, the space of possible ontological designs is severely limited if one only has access to the sort of verbal and visual layers of conscious experience. If your experience of being a self has to do primarily with words and visual field, something like phenomenological self-inquiry is needed to enable a larger design space. So there's another thing I wanted to bring in here, which is this concept of metis, and grounding and groundlessness. This is a phrase you hear a lot in, say, Buddhist traditions or that sort of thing. And so it's a really useful way of thinking about things, and it relates to metis pretty directly. So the world for most people is really grounded in the framings that are transmitted through language, media, and other forms of social conditioning. And these worlds, meaning the phenomenal worlds that we inhabit, are contingent, not necessary, in terms of them being valid and useful ways to represent or model reality. There's equally valid other ways to represent or model the underlying causal reality. And people often experience fear associated with uncertainty or groundlessness, ungroundedness. And so many paths of phenomenological self-inquiry across different traditions end up emphasizing something like that the only true grounding is in groundlessness itself. The only true certainty is in uncertainty itself. The only thing that's permanent is impermanence itself, etc. And so we can think of metis, again, if we go back to the earliest Greek usages of this word, metis has to do with the skill or art of the navigator, or Kubernetes or Kubernator, which is the person who guided a ship through the sea. So navigating the ocean is navigation in a place with no ground, a groundless place. And in fact, the phrase aporia, pathlessness, which is often used in the Greek philosophers' works, also often applies to being lost at sea. Aporia can be an experience of being lost at sea with no navigational skill, no compass. And so someone who is highly skilled in metis seems to be the Greek way of expressing one who is grounded in groundlessness. And this also helps us make sense of metis in terms of deception and cunning. It has these connotations of deception, cunning, trickery. Well, one way to look at that is that lies, deception, trickery, tricksterness are acts of weaponized ontological design. So as far as practice goes, I think it's interesting to take a look at some sort of negative practices. And the two I'm going to take a look at here are fasting and standing steak, or zhangzhang from Qigong or other East Asian systems, usually martial arts inflected. So both of these practices help us play with the boundary between what we feel that we need and what we actually need. With fasting, it's in the case of food and nutrients. With standing steak, it's has to do with the boundary between what we think we can do in terms of our muscles and endurance and what we actually can do. So for those that aren't familiar, standing steak, you essentially stand in a certain posture with your knees slightly bent, your hands usually a little bit out in front of you. Often you're trying to feel the energy of what's going on in your body at the time to develop an awareness of chi flow. But it's quite interesting because a normal human who is not particularly athletic has the ability to stand in such a posture for extraordinarily long periods of time. And yet this becomes extremely mentally difficult after, I don't know, 30 seconds tops for most people. So for every second after those first 30, you're experiencing the difference where you have the felt sense that your body's about to give up. But if you actually have the right incentives or the right discipline or the right dedication, then you can hold that posture for hours. And it really shows you something about the unexplored level of ability and endurance and sort of mind over matter, mind over body quality that can be had that we normally deny ourselves. So we can look at both fasting, I go with a few hours without eating and I might get crabby or grumpy or feel faint or something like that. But humans can go several weeks without eating without permanent damage in most cases. So both of these practices force model updates in the world and self models, which end up, one, expanding the consciously accessible capability set of the individual. They also challenge strongly held beliefs, which are reinforced by culture, about what is and is not safe and what is and is not even possible. And fundamentally, they teach us that we have far more freedom than we thought we did. So these practices, I think, can be taken as models for self-designed practices using the framing of virtualism for challenging the assumptions of our inherited ontologies and frameworks. Another quick example of this is practices having to do with hacking and attentional blindness. Robert Anton Wilson in Prometheus Rising, I believe, has an interesting thing of the quarter game where you spend a lot of focus during the day noticing quarters on the ground. And sure enough, you'll find that you're just finding quarters on the ground all the time. And it's crazy because you never noticed them before. So, the question, of course, that forces you to ask yourself is, were the quarters on the ground all along? Or did somehow your intention to focus on finding quarters on the ground and pay attention to that, did that somehow influence the actual existence of the quarters on the ground? So an interesting little bit of a mind fuck there. And so there's this sort of middle way here, which is not changing reality in the sense that I mean it in virtualism. It's also not wireheading. It's a sort of missing middle. So wireheading is, this idea of just sort of hacking your brain, whether through technology or meditation, into a form where you're just experiencing, maximal pleasure all the time, a sort of hedonistic approach there. You just pleasure center being stimulated through electrodes. You just do jhanic meditation enough that you can just drop into a state of unlimited bliss, something like that. This is possible to do, even just through meditative practices, but it's not recommended for reasons that I hope are obvious. And it's also possible, clearly, to change aspects of external reality. This is what we use technology and our actions in the world to do. And it is recommended to, use your actions and capabilities to change things about reality. But this won't solve many of the pressing issues that we have as individuals and communities. It's also possible to change your desires. This is advocated for by a lot of traditions. For example, you can see shades of this in Stoicism and various Buddhist lineages, etc., where we basically attempt to, instead of desiring things and trying to get them, we instead try to change our desires so that we desire what is. And I mean, this is a good path, and so far as it goes. But if you take it to the extreme, it is essentially identical with the wireheading path. So what is the overlooked middle? It's bearing in mind the virtualist concept of the separation between the phenomenal world as a model that exists in the mind and reality as the underlying causal domain of the shared universe. So we can change our world by consciously hacking the way that the mind processes reality to create the world in self models. So this opens up an entirely new possibility space, much more than the other things I discussed on this slide. When it's approached consciously and with dedication. This isn't the sort of thing that you learn on a weekend retreat. This is the sort of thing that takes quite a bit of time and effort, but has amazing returns. So this world is, in fact, you can view it as a reified ontology that we live inside of, that the self lives inside of. And just like any other ontology, this ontology can be designed, tweaked, and played with. So I'm going to try to connect some of the dots of the bridge series so far. So we talked in the first bridge session about the Keegan stages. As a model, Keegan talks about stage 5 as the self-transforming mind. And so in this case, I think we can think of self-transforming as having to do with a conscious world crafting, ontological design, and a sense of embodied metis, this sort of surfing the waves of change and transforming oneself just as much as one is transforming reality. The neurophilosophy session talked about a bridge from the normal modern scientific framings, and so that we can still retain the power of science and technology. We don't have to uncritically embrace Mysterianism and bad woo, but we can see some of the cracks in our models, our phenomenal worlds, and our experiences of ourselves. The embodiment session talked about embodiment as being critically important through the lens of virtualism, and I think embodiment is an area of human experience which is seriously neglected in the modern value system, the sort of modern value system influenced by science, technology, capitalism, all the other modern ideologies and frameworks for knowledge and ontologies and metaphysics. I mean, neurophilosophy, though, then provides us a reason why we might want to investigate, mine, and refine some of the pre-modern techniques and strategies here. I'll just go out and say, I think probably the Greeks knew more about metis than most of us do. The session on community talked about sanghas, ritual, shared explorations. These all turbocharge all of these processes, and especially something I didn't have as much time to go into as explicitly as I would have liked, initiation processes, in particular, initiation rituals held in a shared space of Communitas, are incredibly valuable for doing this sort of stuff. And then this session on magic. So the end result of combining all of the above ingredients, developing through the stages into the self-transforming mind, taking up neurophilosophy as the best that modern worldviews have to offer with respect to what selves are and how we should relate to them. Picking up some of the techniques, if not the metaphysics and ontologies of the pre-modern peoples who had such a deep understanding of metis and grounding and groundlessness. Really re-emphasizing the community, communitas, the importance of sangha and ritual. Well, the end result of all of this combined, when seen from the perspective of a normal observer in our society, is frankly what most people would call magic. And so I want to end this talk portion of this session by talking about what I would describe as the suggested elements of a complete path. So I see a complete path as having three essential components. We talked in the very first bridge session from Rationality to Woo about how science is not really a path for an individual to walk in the service of living the good life, of becoming a more complete human being. That, a lot of the ancient paths come with some sort of imported medieval or pre-modern epistemologies, ontologies, gender roles, framings like that we might not want to take up. So a lot of us here, when you hear us talking in spaces like the Stoa and adjacent spaces about an ecosystem of practices, right? Well, ecosystems are not just throwing a bunch of shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. Ecosystems consist of niches, which are mutually interdependent and exchanging of energy. So ecosystems can't just be thrown together willy-nilly. There's these mutually interlocking and independent components. So I see an ecosystem of practice as having the following broad elements. One is phenomenological self-inquiry, of course. It's essential. Nearly every path and wisdom tradition, our boy Socrates, the Stoics, Plato, the Buddha, Hindu meditation, Christian mysticism, just about everything talks about the importance of knowing thyself in a very deep way, in a non-verbal way. And so the clarity that's gained through this sort of practice makes the other practices easier and more efficient. And then I would call the second element the practice of sorcery or magic or technology. I kind of think of all of these as really having a certain spiritual kinship and being in the same category, or at least in the same direction. First of all, what was once regarded as magic, when that becomes widespread, we start calling it technology. That's an interesting observation in of its own, right? And somebody, I think in the beginning, threw in the chat the phrase from Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Yup. So this can be a broad umbrella, this second element of the three-part path, for practices which improve one's capabilities to make change in the world and in reality through means associated with intelligence, skill, cleverness, awareness, metis, etc. Technology is an essentially human pursuit. And so I'm talking about the sort of things that humans do and that most other life forms don't do. That's what I'm gesturing at when I say sorcery, magic, and technology as a cluster. So this involves the cultivation of metis. It also involves this cultivation of techne, which is like artistry, craft, skill in Greek. And so if we don't get good at this stuff, then we're going to be ineffective at these other two parts of a complete path. Technology, like, for example, quantified self, biofeedback, neurofeedback, all of the sort of technological aids that we have for our phenomenological self-inquiry practices, super useful, help turbocharge that practice. And if you care about this third section of compassion, friendliness, and service to life, you need to get good at making change in the world through technology, or else your effectiveness in that area is going to be severely limited. So human beings in general become pretty miserable and unfulfilled if we're not working towards something greater than ourselves. At least a family, a tribe, a nation, a religion, something like that. And so part of our evolutionary heritage as social primates is this built-in sense that we need to be contributing to something greater than ourselves. It doesn't require any sort of supernatural explanation or justification as to why this is part of the good life. You get this directly out of evolutionary biology. And if you also have a sort of spiritual framing that justifies this, more power to you. That just gives you some more drive in this area. So meaning itself lives primarily in this part of the triad. Phenomenological self-inquiry often involves the deconstruction of meaning. sorcery, magic, and technology are essentially dependent upon our notions of meaning, but don't provide them in and of themselves. I think that's the ideas of compassion, metta, friendliness, service to life, things like that, and our relational and social selves are where meaning is derived from. That's my read on the situation, at least. I'm not alone in that. So I think that all of these aspects of a complete path are areas of independent cultivation that are mutually supporting. And I just put this out there at the end as a suggestion for those of us, as many of us in this space are rolling our own paths, creating our own ecosystem of practices, and so just this is just an offering in that area. It's not the final word. There are many other ways to approach path creation, and so I just want to go ahead and put that out there and go straight into the Q&A portion, because that's what I've got for today. There's a lot more that can be said about magic, so I'm really interested to see what comes up for everybody here in the session.
All right, some great stuff there. Start putting your questions in the chat, and I'll call on you. Just unmute yourself, ask it to Evan. So Rachel Haywire, I will take you in first. You had a couple questions.
Hi, Evan. I'm glad to finally be here. I love what you're doing with the bridge session, and hopefully I can catch the other three. Yeah, thank you. My question is, I love this grounded and groundlessness, surfing the winds of chaos. I think it's beautiful. It's incredible. It's a higher state to me and many others. But this does not seem to be the default state for the majority of society. The majority of society, they react to groundlessness in a very hostile way, even if it's a higher level of groundlessness. Like one century shaman is another century schizophrenic, so to speak. So my question is, for people that are in this state, that are good at cultivating mentos, is it a good idea to isolate from those who are afraid or don't really get it? Like, what is the best way to deal with people who are going to be intimidated by that kind of thing?
Well, that's a question of active interest and concern for me personally. I mean, we've talked about, a lot of people here know I've essentially been mainly a hermit, other than going to work for the past most of a decade. And so isolation has, in essence, been the path that I've taken so far, but I don't actually believe it's the ultimate or the correct path. And this is why I think Metis is such an interesting lens into what it truly means to be a skilled navigator of a groundless territory. Because Metis is not just about this navigational skill or grounding and groundlessness. It also has these strong overtones of deception, of trickery, of the trickster archetype, of seeing through the tricks of others until you can trick them back, right? Odysseus was famous for his Metis. And so I think that as one develops skill in Metis, and this is an ongoing process in my own life, that one can, through things that might be called trickery, trickster archetype, energy, or deception, interface with the normies in a non-threatening way, while actually in one's own core being perhaps one of the most threatening things imaginable to the current order, if that makes sense.
Any follow-up, Rachel?
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. I like the way that Evan phrased it a lot. Interfacing with people who aren't quite at that level often ends up just, you feel rejected or depressed, and that kind of thing. So cultivating a fluent way to do it, where you're invoking your inner power, but still like having smooth sailing even in those unmoving waters, is something to definitely explore. So yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, follow-up comment to that. I mean, this is, when I talk about magic, I'm restricting myself to the stuff that's somewhat safe to talk about here. And so when we talk about magical acts as acts of internal ontological design having to do with the phenomenal world that our mind generates, that can give us great degrees of freedom as to how we process those experiences that we might currently process as rejection or hostility or so on, because all of that is essentially the result of signal processing in the brain. And through phenomenological practices, ritual, etc., one can significantly alter that lower level, normally subconscious conditioning, the whole Stoic ideal of the obstacle as the path here becomes salient, where I think that these are problems that can be solved through reconfiguring our meaning making internally primarily, rather than having to somehow be differently on the inside. We can hack the interface between inner and outer. So yeah.
All right. Sam Richards, you're up next.
Yeah. So I guess my question you could maybe read as almost like a follow-up to like the question I asked Frank at his second session, which is the way magical practice specifically, like as opposed to, I don't know, like Buddhist practice, Christian practice even to some degree, right, is advertised is changing the world in accordance to will. That's like some fundamental aspect of like almost any type of magic you could look into. And that seems to be deflated in a sense if we rephrase it as just kind of what you were going with, which seemed in line with what Frank was suggesting, right? So like manipulating one's designed ontology to make the experienced world capture a different or broader segment of reality. So I guess, and this is, by the way, kind of like what I personally am really trying to figure out, when I don't have an answer to. So like, I'm just wondering if you think it's even possible to get some mechanism together that would allow magic to work the way it is advertised, right? But also not contradict virtualism, because I mean, virtualism is pretty great, pretty sound. I really like virtualism. I want to kind of accept that, but then I guess that's just sort of what I'm wondering is like, what would that even look like? Like, how do you make a bridge between the sorts of really wacky results one can like find when practicing magic and the logically consistent virtualist picture of the world, without resulting to like really weird and wacky mechanisms?
There's really several questions embedded in that one, so I'll try to tackle a couple of them. So for one, when we talk about these ancient paths, it's important to say, if we take Buddhism as an exemplar, look at the difference between sutric and tantric styles of Buddhism, right? And for a lot of download on this, I highly recommend Charlie and Jared's series, The Evolving Ground, as well as David Chapman's Vividness site, where he writes on Buddhism. And those also provide good references to other resources. But the fundamental thing here is that what you said when you characterized Buddhism is characteristic of Sutric Buddhism only. Tantric Buddhism is quite explicitly a sorcerous or magical path on its own terms. And so there are analogs to this within most of the other ancient traditions. I mean, the Western occult traditions that people like Crowley are offering modern interpretations of are essentially coming from a Christian or a Jewish, basis as well. And they're the sort of left-handed path aspect of those traditions. So it's not quite so clean as, the traditional phenomenological inquiry type lineages are solely about one thing or the other. There's branches of both that get into some really deep magical territory. Now, as to the second question, how do we square virtualism and these related things with like the sort of like actual magic, causal effects that seem supernatural and so on? There's a limit to how much I can say about that. But I will say that I think there is something there. I don't want to go into too many specifics there in a forum like this, because some of this stuff can be straight up cogito or info hazardous, right? There's some strong mimetic hazard here for people, right? And so there's a reason that most of these lineages heavily emphasize guru-disciple or mentor-mentee type relationships where you could really get to know each other. I do see the reasoning for that. And so I don't want to go into too many specifics there, but what I would say is that if one does follow the path implied here, if one does a lot of phenomenological inquiry and really explores the ontological design space of the phenomenal world, and then starts doing essentially a sort of empirical or scientific investigation of what sort of transformations of the world or reality are possible after one has cultivated a lot of this skill, then it does tend to be the case that you start encountering these sort of frankly and bizarrely magical effects. I've certainly had a lot of experiences like that in my life that I still to this day cannot explain in any sort of physicalist ontology. So perhaps in contrast to Frank, I do think there's a there, but that's about the limit to what I can explicitly say about that at this time.
Got it, and definitely helpful. And I will respect you wanting to kind of draw a limit as to what you talk about in this type of a forum for sure.
All right. Rob Hart, you're up next.
Thank you again, Evan. This was like the best in the series so far. These keep getting better. So you've nailed a really profound type of experience, like with a language I never had for it before. It's when you said that like experience could force model updates. The forced model update is just this like profound category of things that happen where you can't change your mind about reality back to what it was. It's just, oh, it's different now. This completely changes things. When that occurs to your model, I guess like my question about it is, can you think of any of those types of forced model updates you've experienced that directly or indirectly shifted your level of metis, that just like turned that on or off?
Yeah, I mean, fasting has been a hugely important thing for my overall level of capability. There's that's the reason I brought it up as a practice, right? Because, you know, when you grow up in this culture, you're conditioned with the idea that things are going to go badly wrong if you don't get 3 meals a day, right? This is something, I mean, people will just flip the hell out if they have to go like 6 or 8 hours without eating. And when you look at the degree to which this constrains your choice, right? You know, you have basically fixed constraints of needing to eat a certain amount each day at certain time intervals, right? And people can be more or less flexible with this, but almost everybody who hasn't tried a fasting practice in a pretty serious way is constrained in that way. And then when they are forced by circumstance, not of their own choosing, to go without food in that context, then it's an utterly miserable experience, in part because it's not chosen, right? But if you start doing extended fasting, you know, and I've done up to over 20 days of water fasting before, right? You unlock the degree to which that's just social conditioning, man. Like you start feeling freaking great. It's like a mild psychedelic after, depending on your body type and previous diet and a few other factors, maybe 2 to 5 days, right? And that feeling great persists until you actually do start eating your own muscle, or your cells do, or whatever, right? And so this just, it blew my mind, the expanded capability set, where I just realized I could just ignore what my model was telling me about hunger for essentially arbitrary periods of time, because I live in a world where I'm never going to go 20 days without eating unless I'm making an intentional practice of it. That opens up a degree of freedom to do other things, to do things in interesting orders, to get deep, long periods of focused work done and not worry, have some anxiety in the back of your mind about consequences of not eating. I mean, that's just one example, right? And also the other example I gave, standing steak. You know, I've had a qigong practice with, you know, varying levels of intensity, but for several years, quite intense. And the degree of sort of freedom that was granted by that, by realizing how much of the limitations of what I thought of as being my physical capabilities were in fact mentally imposed, and the sort of like physically going out and doing stuff sense. Was again, that's the reason I picked that other one as a practice to mention in this context, because both of those were completely transformative. I just can't go back after those type experiences that led to an enduring and still enduring sense of greater freedom and capability.
Any
Okay, I have a
follow-up?
follow-up question. Yeah. So I notice with like model updates and how they get forced to shift, there's also what I've noticed in myself as a spectrum of model updatability. Like certain events will maybe create a new model setting for a while. I'm actually interacting with reality in a different way. But then I could get back into an old pattern of interpretation over a short period of time. So that unstickiness sometimes of the model update seems to have some sort of function. I don't know if it's maybe temperamental or if it's more of a state change. But I notice it also kind of, it could get stuck with like, say a dream state. Like if you have a dream, it changes your mind about something. The memory of the dream fades, the change fades as well. That's It's kind of what I'm talking about. So the question that comes out of that is, what sort of modifications do you think you can make to that stickiness? Like if you want the force model update that you talked about from fasting, how do I know I won't go back to a prior level or something? Or do you think you just need to keep repeatedly fasting?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that there's a universal answer. But for me, fasting practice where I did it pretty regularly for a couple of years, what stuck, and I mean, this is now like 16 to 18 years ago, or roughly about that long ago that I first started doing that. And I still fast occasionally, just, you know, when my body feels like it wants that sort of reset, but I just don't, I haven't had that change. So, but that's just my own personal experience. I think it's worth bringing up the idea of imprint vulnerability, specifically as people like Robert Anton Wilson use this, and to think about the sort of experiences that create imprint vulnerability in us. So this has to do with, you know, like you can think about in the sort of stereotypical like boot camp experience where you get broken down and then built back up. But also you can think about it in terms of, say, psychedelic experience creates additional imprint vulnerability. So does certain types of group ritual, right? This is one of the mechanisms by which cults operate, right? Is because you can create certain felt sense we spaces in which people are feeling very open and vulnerable, and the sort of changes or statements or teachings given in those places tend to stick a lot more than something you just happen to read in a book while you're flipping between your phone and, you know, your computer and like talking to your friend or whatever, which is the state that most of us live our lives in most of the time now. So this points to a certain quality of refined attention, the sort of thing which is cultivated by, in what the Buddhist traditions are called trainings in concentration, as opposed to trainings in insight or morality. And so focused attention, this sort of practice, I mean, you know, Raja Yoga has similar practices, etc. You know, they exist all over the place, right? But really getting into these intensely concentrated states of present moment awareness, I do believe helps shift things out of the verbal consciousness and into the embodied and felt sense consciousness. And I think that that's the part of us that actually learns how to shift ontologies. We don't do this by talking to ourselves. We do this by fundamentally experiencing ourselves in the world in new ways. So hopefully that helps.
All right. Let's see. Aaron, you had a question.
Here I am. Hey, Evan, thanks for doing this. This is great. Let's see. My question was, a lot of rationalist scientific types have an allergic reaction to magic. And what do you think would be the most effective, maybe quick, efficient demonstration of magic for getting a rationalist to believe, let's say, and embark upon the path of curiosity and exploration? Maybe you would call it the best magic trick. And one example I would think of is, like, for myself personally, Alyssa influenced me by kind of exposing me to tarot, which I normally would have scoffed at and been like, that's silly. But actually having a reading done for me and then kind of exploring like what is actually happening here led me down this huge path of kind of like trying to understand New Age, and it just like opened up all these things. And so like tarot seemed like an effective kind of like trick to be like, see, there is something here. So what do you think?
That's a hard one. I have some level of ethical concern about the intent. And what I mean by this is I don't really view it as my place, and I don't really view it as compatible with my understanding of right action to try to influence other people's paths in a direct and explicit way. To me, that's flirting with black magic, right? And so with that caveat, I will say that the sort of experience that I had in domains like this was in some ways psychedelic. So having had a little bit of experience with psychedelics and then interacting with people who just utterly had their shit together, no matter how hard they were tripping, right? And I thought of myself as this big cheese rationalist. I knew all kinds of advanced math. I'd even started doing some meditation and so on. And then like, cool, I hang out with this dude who's like all into this crazy occult magic, Crowley type stuff. And you know, heroic doses, and it's just like you can't even tell the dude's on anything. It's just like utterly competent, utter control, complete verbal fluency, everything going on. I'm like, whatever that is, I want that, because my mind is so jumbled and disorganized and just full of crazy right now. And I saw you take more than I did, and what the hell is going on here? And now, unfortunately, in our legal climate, that's not exactly the sort of magic trick you can get away with, right? But in terms of effectiveness, again, that's a pretty big one. And so I think that is that's one of the sort of most effective demonstrations, and it suggests other types of demonstrations. For example, if people say if you take the practice of fasting. If you hang out with people and they get to know you and they notice that you have a conspicuous lack of dependence on eating at any particular time, that can often arouse some curiosity, right? And so I think of it less as like, how do I convince these rationalist types to look into magic, and more, how do I evoke curiosity so that they might find a way to investigate magic on their own, if that makes sense.
So DMT. Got it.
Caitlin, you had a question? Are you there? Maybe the audio is not working. Okay. Yeah, I don't think your audio is working. So I'll read your question on your behalf. In a lot of these processes, there seems to be a lot of self-trust, self-valuing involved that not everyone knows how to access. What would you say to folks interested in these bridges who don't know to trust their own PSI, intuition, metas?
Something that struck me for a while and still strikes me is one of the books I read that early on in this process that was a huge influence on me, just as it was huge influence on millions of other people, was Ram Dass' Be Here Now, right? And in Be Here Now, he talks about the fact that before approaching, and in this case, he's talking about psychedelic practice, but I would say before approaching any of these extremely powerful practices that might be lumped in with, say, the magical, the tantric, the psychedelic, you sort of need to have your shit together to some degree. I've been focusing this session on a bridge from 4 to 5, right, in terms of Keegan stages. And stage 4 is the self-authoring stage, right? So you kind of already need to be there, I think, to approach this stuff safely and responsibly. So this is not something that I just advise people to just, hey, y'all should totally dive into this if you don't feel a certain self-authoring confidence in yourself. So, Ram Dass said that people should have undergone like 10 years of psychoanalysis, I think was the quote, right? Now, that might be a bit much. I think that psychotherapy modalities have improved substantially in effectiveness and average level of kindness since Ram Dass was doing psychotherapy in the 50s, but something along those lines, dealing with one's emotional traumas, dealing with one's, family conditioning, physical traumas, all that kind of stuff. Like, I'm a big fan of approaching those from more conventional means. And now I'm not saying that that means you need to be completely healed and whole person and have nothing wrong with you before you start approaching, 4 to 5 bridges and magical practices and so on. But, looking at the sort of standard / cutting edge models, like trauma informed psychotherapy and getting your, for one, I should have said this disclaimer in the presentation, so I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to. Do not fast unless you know your body decently and you're in relatively decent physical condition. I would not recommend that, etc. So the stuff that I've been talking about, especially in this session on the 4th session here on magic, this is not zero risk. Okay, Tantra and Buddhism has always been described as a path which may be quick, but has significant risk associated with it. And so, I don't think there's any such thing as a free lunch in this life, and most things worth doing carry substantial risk associated with them. And so it's up to the individual to determine whether or not practices like this are acceptable to them in terms of the risk to reward ratio, and to be cautious about it, because I think that there is the potential for a lot of damage to happen for people that get into this stuff in a an unprepared way. And in fact, you can look at a lot of the history of Western occultism in the past couple centuries. You can look at a lot of the history of Tantra and spiritual practice and the New Age in the West, and see exactly what happens when people don't sort of like, as Jordan Peterson might say, clean your room before getting into this stuff, right? So yeah, definitely recommend that as an important safety aspect of this. Like, you should have your life somewhat conventionally together. Now, as you well know, Caitlin, I didn't. And I feel extraordinarily lucky to have survived the process as well as I did. I had a lot of friends that ended up a lot worse off through getting into this stuff when they were not as prepared. You can get lucky, but you should not count on getting lucky. And adequate preparation and dealing with your own traumas and your own healing in a conventional sense before delving deep into the realms of magic and psychedelia is definitely the approach I would advocate. So yeah.
All right. Josh, you had a question you just posted in the chat. Please read for me. Okay. I'm super interested in what bridging looks like within instantiated communities, framing Game B's transition stage as a radical improvement in a significant amount of the world's population sense making. What does bridging look like in smart villages and VR communes and institutions?
So I think that bridging often involves a community transition, you know, something that Keegan talks about occasionally. I mean, it's not just individuals that sort of have stages, if you will, right? Communities also have stages. And since stages have to do with the way that we relate to value and meaning making and sense making, then when one transitions into a new stage or new way of being with respect to meaning and value and how one is in the world, one's ontologies, one's world models, etc., that can be incompatible with one's pre-existing community. So I think that, you know, in reference to that question, I think of it as having some level of connectedness and flexibility between communities that can allow for smooth transitions. It's sort of like when you think about breaking up in relationships, it's a shame that it has to be so painful for everyone, because most relationships aren't going to last forever. And the phrase gets tossed around sometimes of conscious uncoupling, right? Doing the same sort of thing with respect to one's community, I think, is an important thing to bear in mind if one takes the path of personal development very far, because it's entirely likely that you will lose the ability to relate to people and communities that you deeply care about in the same way as you used to, because your fundamental values and ontology and way of making meaning in the world has shifted. And so if communities can exist in a sort of, you know, I love the phrase, I think it was Greg that used it, a sort of rooted cosmopolitan aspect where there's a grounded pluralism going on, that maybe we can all be joined regardless of our developmental stage by our respect for the earth that we live on, and the fact that it gives possibility for us to experience this life. That seems like a pretty universal value for anybody stage 3 or beyond. And you know, and therefore engage in some conscious uncoupling or community transition when appropriate, because really one size fits all does not fit all in these matters. And so I think there is a bit of an unavoidable transition that has to happen at the community level when people make their own big transitions in a personal way.
All right. Alyssa, you had a question. I got a lot of +1s.
Hi, Evan. So my question is, what do you make of individuals who naturally embark on the path of magic from a young age without significant outside influence or initiations from familiar or cultural lineages? What do you think is really going on in the psyche of these individuals?
I don't know if it's just their psyche, first of all. I mean, when you think about it, there are people who from an early age are incredibly graceful and natural dancers. There are people who from an early age have just uncanny levels of skill at throwing rocks or other objects accurately and far with their hands, right? And now we have outlets for those people in our society right now, right? You can go become a basketball player or a baseball player. you can go become a professional dancer, a gymnast, or acrobat. And these are like commonly accepted roles that exist within our society that provide a path when somebody shows those proclivities from a young age. But as a society, I doubt you'd disagree with me here that magic as a whole is pretty deeply in our culture's shadow. And so when someone exhibits natural proclivities for material that is culturally shadowed, then it's often a really difficult journey. And you can look at older societies that probably did this a lot better. I mean, you look at indigenous tribes in South America or Africa, often these proclivities are recognized early, and these people are apprenticed from a young age with masters of these traditions. The same thing happened in ancient Greek culture. When people showed these inclinations from an early age, there were the traditions of, the sort of warrior poet, or the sort of iatromantis, the oracle, etc., that these proclivities could be identified, and people could be, directed into paths that would be hopefully minimally painful or maximally effective, or, some combination thereof. But because this stuff is so deeply shadowed in our society, I mean, it's really difficult to know how people like that can or should make sense of their situation until they reach the age at which they can find the others, right? I mean, and for some of us, that doesn't happen until quite late in our lives. And I find that to be tragic. But I mean, part of why I'm even doing this series called The Bridge and trying to bridge rationality and woo is to make some tiny little contribution towards answering that issue, right? And say that I don't think that there's anything un-Western or unsophisticated about magic and personal development and phenomenological inquiry and dream work and yoga and all this sort of cluster of things, right? I think it's shadowed material, and as a culture, the more we can publicly bring this forward into the light, discuss it, then maybe we can be our own little beacons for, like, maybe some 12-year-old happens on this STOA video and realizes they're not alone. If that happens, great, or they find the right book in the bookstore. That's the sort of thing that happened to me. And I mean, I was lucky enough to have a family where interest in this sort of thing wasn't completely discouraged, but I deeply feel for the people that didn't have that level of luck. And I guess, I don't really have much to offer there other than like that we should all, who care about this stuff and have some level of personal stability, try to reach out and find the people who are naturally inclined to this and who don't have anyone else to turn to, whether or not we feel that we're qualified, just be friends to these people.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. I agree. There's that natural proclivity that certain individuals have. Is there, as a follow-up, any kind of like one advice you might impart an individual who might be feeling that way, who might stumble on this video? Anything you'd say to them?
The particular metis of deception by saying things that are technically true, but not the whole truth. So, for example, a multitude of sins can be covered by the word meditation or mindfulness. Oh, I'm just practicing meditation. I'm just doing mindfulness. Well, nobody has direct access to your own interiority. So learning to describe things in ways that are not going to get you, culturally shunned while still working on these practices yourself might feel icky to some degree, especially in a culture like ours that raises children to believe that honesty is always the right answer and you should always tell the full truth. I don't actually believe that's correct. When you live in a dysfunctional society with broken values, sometimes in order to work for the good of all life, you have to deceive those who don't have life positive values. And I think that it's eminently ethical to do so, especially in ways that are plausibly deniable. Like, say you're working on mindfulness when you're actually doing some crazy tantric thing or something like that.
Thank you.
All right, Megan, you had a question.
Thanks. I really appreciated part of your answer to Aaron's question about it resting on intent, and that having a manipulative intent is the way to black magic. And there's a kind of difficult middle ground that I sometimes find myself falling into that I'd love to hear you expand on. It's where it's the desire to influence people that's for their own good or for the greater good, yet is still a manipulative desire. And it's an awkward kind of knife edge thing that could go both ways. I'm wondering if you have your own mental processes to avoid that kind of trap that you could share with us.
So I'm going to take a page out of Forrest Landry's book here, because the way that I tried to do this stuff maps really well onto one of his most famous quotes, which is that love is that which enables choice. Love is always stronger than fear, and always choose on the basis of love. So my answer to this is that I try to ask myself, is what I am doing enabling greater choice for the others, or is it constraining their choices in some way? And that's the answer for me in terms of how I determine which ways to approach people and what to share and how to try to influence things, right? Because it's dark, it's black magic, it's not good if you are doing things in a way that tries to box people in and constrain their choices. There's a level of faith or trust that's required here. You have to trust, I at least have to trust at some level that people are fundamentally good. And what I mean by this is that when given the choice, they're going to do the best they can, right? You know, I forget which philosopher, maybe a Stoic, maybe Plato, somebody like that talked about how everyone you know is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. You know, we can't know what people are dealing with in their lives. And so this whole urge to judge and think that we know what's best is like, you know, it's a trap, because it causes us to want to act in ways which constrain the choices of others. And I think that's about as close to evil as you can get. So I would say, ask yourself, am I enabling greater choice for people, or am I acting in ways to try to box them in, pen them in, or constrain their choice? And that's the guidepost that I use for that sort of thing.
That was perfect. Thanks very much.
All right. Adam, you had a question?
Thank you. I wanted to ask, you were talking about having your shit together or reaching some sort of stage where you decide yourself, okay, I'm ready to go to learn more or to explore more. And I keep bumping into people who I myself judge as not being ready, but it may just be my projection of my insecurities and my own fears. But yeah, sometimes it's just very young people, very young and creative, imaginative, but they have the opposite distrust of the scientific or the rationalist part, and take high doses of psychedelics or go into really really destabilizing altered states of consciousness, and like witnessing that hurts. But I also don't want to be some sort of a guy who is like coming around like an uncle saying like, hey, you should not do that, get your shit together and then you can do DMT or something. So how would you have you encountered this, or how would you approach this to protect people but also don't restrict them in their own self-inquiry?
So I'm going to answer this starting in a kind of weird way. Some of the best advice I ever got from a friend was never lend someone money that it's going to hurt you if you don't get paid back. Because if you do, then it might destroy your friendship. But if you treat it as a gift and then as a bonus if you get paid back, then you're never going to destroy your friendships over lending money, right? So taking that same sort of principle, you can't control people's choices no matter how hard you try. It's unethical to act in ways that attempt to constrain other people's choices. So given those two things, my answer is to make myself available to help clean up the messes that other people find themselves in as much as I can without it cutting to the bone, without it hurting too deeply. You have to understand your own limitations and boundaries, but you know, it's a lot better for someone if you don't say, I told you so. And what I mean by this is if you know these people and you say, you know, you can warn them from a place of you know, a positive, like, I care about you place. And if they go and make their mistakes anyway, there's no point in being mad at them or telling them, I told you so, or making them feel bad about it. To the extent that you can without damaging yourself, be there to catch them when they fall. But you don't owe that to anyone. You need to, you know, physician, heal thyself. You need to maintain your own sovereignty and integrity. So sometimes you have to let them fall and go splat because you can't catch them without getting splatted yourself. But to the extent that you can catch them when they fall so that they don't go splat, then, I mean, then do that in a way where you don't unnecessarily remind them that you told them so. You don't focus in on their failings. It's not about being right and being the one who was wise and who saw what was going to happen in advance. Who cares? That's your ego wanting some aggrandizement when you feel the urge to say those kinds of things, or at least for me it is. I would simply say that, you know, extend as much compassion to these people, and not just some abstract feeling of compassion, but like actual practical matters of like, can you physically help them get through their lives in the world? And do as much of that as you can without compromising your own integrity in your own life. And that's really the best I got there.
Peter, can I get a follow up on that?
Sure.
Thank you, Evan. I think my follow up would be on the idea of the path, or the concept of the path, going from stage to stage, which somehow suggests that there's some things you need to do first before you go and explore something more, like heal your emotional trauma, and then maybe go into like new ontological design or something. So maybe that the linearity, or the stage, the leveling up is what gives me this question, like, what is the thing I should heal first? In a lot of these, why I'm asking is, like, in a lot of these encounters, I hear that people want to go really far because they think they will get their shit together through like going some heroic doses and doing some really destabilizing acts, because they think that conventional therapy is part of the problem, and like all these conventional things, this is not going to help me. I'm not going to get financially stable or something. I'm just going to go jump off the cliff, and that's going to help me. And this stage designs, like, or I go through that first and then go to a next level. Yeah, these are these two things I want to put. I want to compare. Like, is there an order of doing these things, or how to approach that?
So I do think there is an order of operations, but it's important to realize that there's an order of essentially insights that one needs to have, not an order of specific techniques or things or modalities that one needs to do, right? And so that's one thought. Another thought that's related is it has to do with the pre-trans fallacy that Ken Wilber talks about, right? You're likely going to get triggered as fuck by people that are one stage different from you, okay? So if you find yourself getting triggered as fuck by people, that probably indicates that you're within one stage of them. Third component to the answer is an insight that I got from a guy who's a friend of mine, who's a math educator. Actually, he's been on the STOA before, but anyway, he talked about how to really be a good teacher of a certain topic in mathematics, you should have studied at least 5 years of classes beyond that. That's how much more advanced you should be to be able to really competently hold students. Like, so if you're teaching Algebra 1, you better know at least through like Calc 2 or something like that, right? You're trying to teach Calc 2, show me your algebraic topology and differential geometry. Cool, right? So the point is that when we combine these three ideas, you will be extremely poorly equipped to judge the preparedness or readiness of someone that's within one stage of you because of the pre-trans fallacy. You have to be significantly beyond someone before you can adopt any sort of real teacher role in any sort of effective way that's not just going to involve a projection of a bunch of your own shadow shit onto them, right? And preferably a lot more than a little bit beyond them, using that math teacher example, right? So that's the sort of advice that I would give in this situation, is that when you're just looking at people like, man, you are doing the stupidest thing, I can't, that's an indicator that you're probably actually fairly close to them developmentally. And that maybe trying to take a mentor or teacher role with them is fraught with danger for both of you because of the sort of shadow projection of pre-trans fallacies, if that makes sense.
That's pretty cool. Evan, are you okay to go a little bit after the bottom of the hour? Just cool.
Yeah, totally. We got a little bit of a late start. I'm happy to stick around to make that up.
Cool. So I have a question. Chris D asked something earlier about politics and magic. And, it comes to mind like the crazy culture war stuff about Pepe, me magic, and the 2016 election. And also, what was the other one that I was thinking about? Yeah, military. And imagine if this stuff works, they're experimenting with it to some capacity across the world. So I'm curious if you have any awareness or thoughts on that. And then also with self-help too, like the New Thought movement, The Secret, all that type of stuff. So how's magic intersecting with all these different kind of industries and disciplines?
So yeah, I've actually thought about putting something about The Secret and Law of Attraction into the presentation. So I think that very much has to do with the sort of hacking of one's phenomenal world model that I was describing. Most of the effects that one sees from people who are like all about The Secret and the Law of Attraction, I think can be pretty adequately explained through the lens of virtualism in terms of altering the way that their mind generates their world model from the available inputs in lower level reality. So I do see a connection there. As far as the military sort of stuff goes, I think it's interesting. Like, have you checked out? I think it's called Stealing Fire, right, by Jamie Wheel and somebody else. I forget the other author, right? So in this, they talk about performance secrets of Navy SEALs and other type of elite operators as part of the discussion. And if you talk to these people, especially like you talk to people that are special forces or formal special forces, paramilitary, like CIA, black ops type people, a lot of the stuff they do in their training and in their sort of maintenance and practice of skills is quite recognizable to somebody with a background in, say, tantric practice, right? So yeah, like what we used to consider squarely in the realm of magic has very much bled into the realm of world-class level high performance training. Of which the military is clearly one practitioner. And I mean, like, even I know a few people that work in programs having to do with meditation and mindfulness under organizations like DARPA and other Pentagon organizations. So there's been a very active military interest in this sort of stuff for a while. And it's like I said in the beginning of the presentation, magic that becomes commonly known, we just refer to as technology. Right. So, think about psychotechnology. Psychotechnology is essentially that bit of this sort of magic that I'm talking about, which has been brought into the cultural light. But that doesn't mean that that's all of it. And so when we talk about, say, the election stuff, the political stuff that you're talking about, I think it's interesting when we think about the fact that you don't necessarily have to fully understand how a technology works in order to use it. I mean, how many people here could, even in the most abstract terms, correctly describe the exact sequence of events that happens in order for your computer to be projecting an image of me and my voice on your screen, right? Like even just down to the level of like TCP and UDP. But no, we got to get down to the level of registers, transistors, bit flips. Okay, almost nobody knows how this stuff works, and yet it works and we all use it, right? So in that sense, very few people here could prove to their own satisfaction that the device that you are looking at Zoom on right now is in fact technological as opposed to magical. That's an article of faith that people have, right? Unless you fully understand the entire stack from semiconductor fabrication all the way up to high-level programming languages and web calls, this is magic for you, right? And so similarly, within the sort of realm of meme magic, right? The way that the subjective phenomenal world interfaces with reality, and through a tunnel in reality interfaces with other people's subjective phenomenological worlds, and the way that this interface can persist and reify and become an intersubjective field, like things that we like to talk about as we space. These are all absolutely hackable in the same sense that any other information system is hackable. And a lot of the sort of meme warfare that's going on is people using weapons that they don't understand. The same way that most people don't understand how the technology works, and most people couldn't even build a gun if they had to. So just because people use it doesn't mean they understand it, but the more that you delve into this stuff and understand it, I do think it gives you some essentially superpowers with respect to the meme war, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be a fruitful session on its own. Let's close off with Chris D. You had a question that would be good to end with.
Yeah, Evan, thanks for the series. It's been a pleasure. So I'm going to do a simple question. Where do you see the bridge moving forward? Do you see like things popping up like a group podcast or experimental space or a discussion forum? How would you like to see the people in the Discord participate, while not necessarily manipulating them to do so?
Yeah, so I mean, I created the Discord so that people who were interested in the material that I presented here would have a place to discuss specifically that sort of stuff. And the reason that I thought it wanted its own Discord is because this is a pretty eclectic combination of ideas. I mean, I'm not the first person to put these ideas together, but you don't see them all presented in one space very often. And so it's kind of a strange attractor, but it's kind of a hard to find attractor. I spent many years looking for people to talk to about this stuff and didn't have a large group to talk to about this stuff until I found the STOA. So, you know, as we all know, it may be the end of the STOA on March 21st. So the Discord was created to be an independent space that could persist so that people could just talk to each other in whatever way feels right. So I don't really have much of a desire or a goal state for the Discord other than maintaining a space where people who find some resonance with the ideas presented in the bridge can share their own perspectives. I'm certainly not the last word or the be all end all on these things. And so I've already been impressed by a lot of the cool things and interesting insights that people have put into words or shared through links or what have you on the Bridge Discord. And I hope that will continue. As far as the bridge as an effort, this is definitely not the end of the bridge. Yes, a communal podcast is hopefully going to be in the works. I can see the potential for future one-off sessions or a series of sessions, and sort of an idea that's been thrown around is something in the context of taking a sort of bridge inflected or bridge tinted lens on various practices, you know, as a series, or various traditions, and sort of looking at how we might update those and express those through the languages of staged models and virtualism and metis and so on. You know, so there's a lot of different directions that this could go. As those of you that are in some of the other groups with me know, this is an incredibly busy time period in my life. So I'm not sure exactly when that will happen, though it won't be too long. I've just got to get over a bit of a hump with other commitments, but this is certainly not the end of the bridge, whether or not this happens on the STOA or not. You know, you can follow me. If I do something that's not on the STOA, I'll announce it on Twitter. So I'll put my Twitter handle, which I never post anything, so don't get too excited, but I'll put my Twitter handle because I will announce stuff having to do with the bridge there. And so this is an ongoing experimental effort, and I'm interested in collaboration, particularly the communal podcast. I'd like to get a group of people who are interested in these topics so that it's not just my voice, so that we can explore this together. Again, I've emphasized the importance of a Sangha, of a community, and hopefully one thing that can come out of the Discord and any future efforts in this area is the felt sense of a bridge Sangha that feels a little bit of Communitas as we explore this territory together. So I'm very open to ideas, and yeah, if stuff happens off STOA, I'll announce it through Twitter. Don't get too excited about me posting anything else there. I'm kind of allergic to social media, so hope that was a useful answer.
Very cool. So Evan, the end of the series, epic 4-part series, any closing thoughts, words for us here as bridge fanatics?
Well, I guess in closing, I would say that I deeply appreciate everyone who showed up. I had no idea that this series would have such a level of interest, and it's been an honor and a pleasure to get to hang out with y'all and share some thoughts. Like I said, I see this as an ongoing project. I see it as complementary to many other projects that are going on in adjacent spaces. So I'm not trying to create a monopoly here, but I think a plurality, a multiplicity of efforts from different angles is needed for us to make the transitions, both as individuals, communities, and society, to avoid the worst potential effects of the meta crisis. And I mean, that's really what this is all about. That's why I started this. Based on David's article for that initial bridge session, I do see this sort of development as being a crucial key to routing around some of the potential damage that exists in likely future timelines for our world and our species. So I'm super interested in collaboration in the future with people. like I said, I'm not the ultimate master of any of this stuff. So critiques, criticisms, ideas, questions. Looking forward to what everybody here has to offer. And yeah, I think that as a focus that I'm going to be looking at in the near future is in the realm of what I would call social psychotechnology. I think that's pretty much the limiting factor here. We don't really need additional external physical technology beyond our current capabilities. What we need is better coordination mechanisms, more respect for each other and the planet, and better social psychotechnologies for making decisions in ways that respect each other and the planet. So that's what I'll be trying to bridge to next.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but let's all get off mute and just thank Evan for this wonderful series and for him giving his gift to the STOA and people gathering around the digital campfire.
Thanks,
So
Evan.
thank you.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Way to
Evan,
go.
that was excellent. Thank you. Very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I keep
Cool.
the room dark so you can't see how often I blush.
You hit it well, my friend. All right, so plugging a few events. I just unmuted myself. There's a bunch of communal podcasts coming up. One of them with Aaron and Alyssa on shadow play. So I will take in Alyssa, if you can speak on that.
Yes. So every week we do have the Shadow Play series, which is an exploration in playful exercises to engage with the shadow. But we'll also be doing a communal podcast starting in February, where we'll be bringing on some experts in the field. Right now, we've got some Jungian analysts who are booked to join us for discussions of the shadow. So you can check out Shadow Play Fridays at 6 in preparation for the communal podcast next month.
And then that will be posted. There's a couple events I got to post. They'll be posted tomorrow. And we're doing a new thing for a bunch of events for patrons only. And one of them is going to be called Stealing the Culture with Dialogos. And it's going to be a 4 combination, like people you never really seen before. And one of the first one is going to be on the collective shadow. So we're going to watch my good friend Lubomir Arzov. He did this film called In Shadow. And Lubomir is my he's so plugged into this magic kind of stuff. So he's like my spiritual advisor in it. And so Lubomir, Aaron, and Chris, and Uba Boros is going to be having that. Aaron, do you want to speak a little bit on how that's going to go?
Yeah, so the first session in the Stealing the Culture with Dialogos, Collective Shadow is going to be the topic. As Peter said, we're going to watch Lubomir's In Shadow video, and then we're going to do a 4-way discussion about the shadow. I posted some links in the chat if you want to check out who these people are, and it should be a lot of fun.
Beautiful. And then our last upcoming event is going to be another Patreon event. So I never, when I had all these in-person groups, I never kind of cracked the code for the book club. So I'm really going to try to crack the code. And we're going to read Byung-Chul Han's Agony of Eros. I have all Byung-Chul Han's books, all his collections. They're really neat. They're all short and kind of crisp, and he's a really great philosopher. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up. I think it's next Sunday's the event. So that being said, Evan, everyone, thank you for coming to the STOA today. I don't have any music, so let's play some Rage Against the Machine, I guess.